Welcome. Welcome to the Wednesday of Holy Week. For the past 2 days, Jesus occupied the temple courts during the day, teaching and amazing crowds of people who are coming to celebrate Passover. He has gripped the attention of the crowds. In the evenings, Jesus and his disciples retreat out of the city, usually stopping in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray before going to Bethany, where they probably spent the night at the home of Mary and Martha. Wednesday is probably not that different. During the day, Jesus would have been teaching, and in the evening, they might have stopped to pray. But as they get back to Bethany, they actually are invited to the home of Simon for supper. Mark records what happens that night in chapter 14, verses 1 to 11. Now, the Passover was only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and to kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came in with an alabaster jar full of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on Jesus' head. Some of those present said indignantly to one another, "Why waste this perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over. Wednesday is a day that sees both great devotion and great betrayal. The supper, an unnamed woman anoints Jesus with a jar of pure nard, an expensive perfume that probably came from India. It was common when one had guests to pour a couple of drops of perfume on them as they arrived or as they sat down to the meal. But this woman went far beyond, breaking the jar which held the precious ointment and pouring it over Jesus. The breaking of the jar was a way to express that she was giving it all to him and her all to Jesus. She held nothing back. It's an extravagant gift. It was a gift of love, a gift of devotion. Some of the disciples complained it was worth more than a year's wages and it could have been sold to raise money to give to the poor. But Jesus rebuked them and called the woman's actions both beautiful and timely. This was a once-in-a-lifetime moment for Jesus and the woman. It was one of the final acts of kindness that Jesus received before his death. You can imagine how this gift of kindness and love, expressed in such a personal way, uplifted and blessed Jesus' heart during a very difficult week. Whether the woman understood the full significance or not, I'm not going to pretend to know. But Jesus saw in her gift a preparation for his death. And I find in that a great encouragement. Sometimes we don't always know how impactful even one of those spur of the moment, maybe even one of those extravagant acts of kindness can be for someone who is facing a difficult time. Sometimes we hold back because we're worried about being embarrassed or that our motives would be misunderstood. But if God prompts us to kindness, in his eyes at least, it is a beautiful thing. Now, Mark surrounds this beautiful moment with a great act of betrayal. When Jesus cleared the temple courts, the temple leaders began to plot his death. And they would have acted sooner, but they were afraid of the crowds who believed Jesus as a great teacher and a man of God. Jewish law required that everyone who lived within 15 miles of the city would come to Jerusalem for Passover. But of course, many more came. You might remember Jesus' family would actually make that 64-mile journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem every year. The population of Jerusalem could then triple or even quadruple at Passover. And all of those people gathered for a big celebration also meant that emotions and religious fervor could easily get out of hand. So that's why the temple authorities were in a quandary. They had to do something to get control of their temple back, but if they tried to do something when Jesus was teaching, his listeners were liable to riot. So they needed a way to secretly get rid of Jesus without provoking the emotions of the crowds who loved Jesus. They decided the safest thing to do was wait till after Passover get Jesus then, so at least this wouldn't happen another year. Then Judas comes to them, offers to find a way for them to arrest Jesus out of the sight of the crowds. It was perfect for them. And without Judas, they might never have been able to find the right moment to execute their plan. We know why the temple authorities wanted Jesus gone, but why did Judas do it? Mark doesn't tell us why. John and Luke say it was for the money. Perhaps Mark hints at that by using this betrayal to frame this extravagant gift by the woman. But we don't really know for sure what motivated him. I think one of the most disturbing statements that Mark makes about Judas is the phrase, one of the 12. Mark 14:10 says, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to betray Jesus." Later, at the moment of betrayal, Mark writes, "Judas, one of the 12, appeared with a crowd armed with swords and clubs." He is numbered with the closest followers of Jesus. So what happened? I think Jesus was a disappointment to Judas. Jesus was not who Judas wanted him to be. Judas became one of the 12, not to become a follower of Jesus, but to be able to work out his own plans, his own desires, his own ambitions in his own heart. He thought Jesus was a way to power and fame, maybe even wealth. When Jesus started talking about death and sacrifice and praised a woman for such a waste of money, it became clear to Judas that Jesus wasn't going to follow his plans and his expectations. So I think Judas was frustrated and disappointed. Instead of surrendering his life to Jesus, he wanted Jesus to surrender to him. And when Jesus chose his own way, the way of the cross, Judas was so incensed that he betrayed Jesus. And that's at the core of sin. Pride, selfishness, a desire to do what we want rather than follow what God wants. We want God to conform to our expectations rather than allowing ourselves to be made into his likeness. And if a guy who was one of the 12 could let it happen to him, it can be a temptation for any of us. But our response doesn't have to be betrayal. Rather, like the woman who gave her all to Jesus, who surrendered her all to Jesus, we can come to Jesus seeking to learn from him and to follow him and to have our lives shaped by Jesus, rather than trying to shape Jesus into our wants.